have been stripped of their rights, and these democracies are fragile, that they can do nothing else but to reinstate the basic dignity that people deserve. First, on the interests of Patraland, I think this will be relatively undisputed within this debate. Of course, it is to preserve democracy in the fairest manner, particularly in post-colonial states when there are individuals that have been disadvantaged, people that have been silent for a long period of time, people that have increasing resentment against the types of things that they face, but also because there are likely to be like inter-caste violence and things like that. We think it is offering the incentives of the government to act in the fairest way possible and to not give any particular advantages to certain groups, but rather to signal that we are treating everyone equally. The second is, of course, you want to retain and establish stability. Often these are places that have gone through a long amount of conflict, so a lot of resources have been depleted over here in the types of things that have been carrying on. But also there has been a massive amount of economic loss. So colonials or like any sort of conflict leads to plunder, it leads to looting, and it means that a lot of resources are just stripped from people. This also means that people are particularly vulnerable right now, and they don't have access to basic resources that they're likely to get. So of course we want to ensure stability so that we can ensure that we get somewhat investment in the long term. But lastly, it is important for all post-colonial states, particularly democracies, to be able to set up state institutions. You need to make sure that these things are set up fast and that people trust these institutions, and only then can you make sure that people are able to exercise their rights and be able to access these things in the long term. We're going to win by proving why all of these interests are best off on our side. The first thing that I want to do is characterize what Southeast Asia looks like, particularly within the context of this debate. We think in Southeast Asia, it goes without saying that population growth is quite sporadic and rapid. There are often explosions that are happening. This looks particularly because there are agricultural societies, which means that like a lot of people need additional labor, which is why families are incentivized to have additional things. But secondly, within post-conflict states where there have been like large amounts of violence and things like that, you just want to ensure that your community ends up thriving and stuff, which is why there are communal and governmental narratives to make sure that you've had large amounts of population. But governments also incentivize these things because they want to ensure that they have enough labor to be productive in the long term. But secondly, particularly in Southeast Asia, we think land division is often quite unstable and is done in quite weird manners. This is because land masses themselves are divided unevenly. So if you look at Indonesia, it's like one large island chain which is divided into many different things. But also because of post-colonial states, these sort of arbitrary boundaries that a lot of like religion and caste ended up drawing meant that land mass is quite uneven right now and is distributed in quite weird ways. But thirdly, we think the cultural diversity in these places is massive. This is because there have been like large amounts of colonial powers that have been in power over here. So there are mixed sorts of incentives, and the way that religions evolve by collaborating with these different influences has also changed a lot in the past. The last thing I want to prove on post-colonial state is just that the devastation that has happened in massive. So I want to note, our stance in this debate is simple. We don't have to prove that everything is fixed in the first election, but at least on opening up, we're going to set the right setting stones and the right mindset for individuals to trust the government to ensure that in the long term we're able to develop in far better ways. The first argument coming from opening government then is simple. We are the only ones that give the fairest access to democracy on our side. Of course, populations are going to grow, but the info site says that this is going to get fixed, which means that we can account for future changes in population, which means that sure, maybe right now it is a bit uneven and weirdly balanced, but if we ensure that in the long term that people and we're able to adjust these constituencies with how populations end up changing, we ensure that in the long term we're able to establish people having equal access to vote. What is the problem in status quo? We think land division is just done particularly badly in post-conflict states because it doesn't look like equal amounts of land being spread out. It means that most land is in control and the interest of industrialists, people that have had power within the interim government as well, people that were often funding these governments and funding the conflict. These are the people that often are zamindars who have access to large amounts of land, and we think a lot of this land is often concentrated together. So we have like 100-acre farm one place, and often farmlands are like quite fertile and agriculturally diverse, so the soil is best over here, which means that a lot of these industries end up starting together. The difference is that a lot of people are then squeezed into settlements, so shanty, like places on the outskirts of the cities where facilities aren't as good. And I think the model that they have to defend is one where the zamindars continue to retain power of this and end up making significant decisions on the constituencies and the voting power that they have, versus on our side when we can still adjust for population and how they diverse over time and things like that. But thirdly, we think these are individuals that have often been stripped of their most basic rights. I just want to note colonialism and conflict is the worst thing that can happen to individuals, specifically those on ground. You often lose your dignity because you have people marching into your home, parading into your things and looting your things. It looks like people taking away your child and indoctrinating them into like war and indoctrinating them into perverse narratives. It looks like your choice being taken away because you can no longer control what is the next thing that is going to happen to you in your day, and a lot of these times you end up getting lost in the crossfire. But thirdly, property rights themselves have been taken away, and this is another hunt that they have to deal with. A lot of the ways that this land was distributed often came at the cost of vulnerable individuals, people who no longer have access to this land, and these were the individuals that end up losing out on their side. First, on why democracy is important. I want to note in post-colonial states, developing state institutions takes a large amount of time. So you need to first write out a constitution, sure, because you want it to be idealistic, this just takes time, you don't have enough political experts. But secondly, to be able to do law and power and justice and things like that, you need to have a streamline of people coming into these places, and only then can people opt into this. So your police force, for example, won't be effective unless you have enough time to be able to train these individuals and things like that. We think particularly in these contexts that when there aren't enough state institutions that are developed, the only right and the only ability that the state has to grant any sorts of rights to these individuals only comes from the right to vote. We think this voting is done particularly good on our side because it's done in the fairest manner. Each individual is now told that their vote matters equally. What does this mean for this debate? First, it means greater amounts of participation. Only when people trust that the state is giving them equal rights and is no longer continuing to go down the path that they already had during the conflict, are people likely to believe that the state is willing to do good things. Before I impact this further, point.
Do I care if my vote has value, or do I care if I get good outcomes from the vote?
Yeah, so the reason that we don't consider that into this debate is because rights takes precedence over utilitarian values. This means that I might want to have sex with Yasho, but if Yasho does not consent to it, if he does not have the rights to own that property, then I don't have the ability to exercise my rights over them. I don't take the utilitarian metrics to come at the cost of their rights. I think things like choice, things like dignity are sorts of like principles that we weigh and care about regardless of whatever utilitarian metrics that we're able to get at the end of this, which is why we ought to care more about preserving people's rights, and we're further going to unlock if we have better mechanisms to getting investment in the first place. First, only when we're able to get people to participate in these democracies are we able to increase representation. So when each minority member thinks that their vote has an equal power and is going to get representation and is therefore going to vote for policies that are best for me, do they end up showing to voting booths in the first place rather than labeling on in the forest every day. But secondly, this means that you trust the state even more. So of course state institutions take time, and a lot of the benefits that states can trickle down to these individuals. So things like rations, things like medicine and things like that often take time. It's only when people believe in the state that the state is doing good for them are they willing to take on these sacrifices. They're okay with making short-term sacrifices because they know that eventually the state is going to develop. So the idea of a national identity is far better on our side, and people are willing to make those sorts of concessions. But thirdly, only when you're able to educate these people and feel that they're given equal value are you able to prepare them for the sorts of business investments that come in. We think on comparative, when people continue to see the harms of post-colonial societies where votes are not distributed equally, we think these are individuals that are far more likely to riot. These are not individuals that want to settle down, particularly in instances where the constitution is being drafted and their long-term futures are being decided on, which means they're far more likely to be violent and crack down against the government on their side.
Hello, how are you going as with opposition? POS preferably from closing, preferably post the minute. I'll take it. Alright, starting in 3, 2, 1. I only think my vote matters if there is actual good outcomes coming from it. Insofar as I do not go ahead and receive the benefits of my vote, I do not think that my vote essentially matters, or I do not think that I am equally represented in my country or in my society at all points of time. Notice how the burden that we go ahead and take is to show that we go ahead and give everybody equal representation and go ahead and show that everybody has like the equal amount of representation in the parliament at all points of time. But they systemically use this, and I'm going to give you one. What do these countries probably look like? And note how do cities essentially come about, right? You have massively dense populated areas in like a small in a small piece of land, or like semi-small piece of land, meaning that you have an area of land which is densely populated, which is one that accumulated mostly of people from the higher classes, because one they can actually afford to live here when the cost of living is extremely high. But more importantly, that you inherently go ahead and have these places that are densely populated. But second, notice how vote banks inherently happen, right? Notice one, every single political representative wants to be voted again and again. You go ahead and do this by doing things like appealing to the majority so that you win in your constituency at all points of time. Understand why we go ahead and have a much better way to determine constituencies. Because note, constituencies are the only way you have representation on the larger political scale. What does that side probably look like? Notice that you go ahead and determine constituencies based on population. But insofar as there are densely populated areas with having majority of the people on the higher class of society, you go ahead and give them way more representation on that side of the pattern. How does this happen? Note, cities are densely populated. You want to go ahead and give them particular constituencies. This looks like Bangalore now having 40 constituencies instead of 2, which they probably deserve on the basis of land masses, right? Notice like this is bad. One, insofar as this happens, notice that you have asymmetric distribution of representation at all points of time. You have way more constituencies and way more leaders coming out of cities representing the people that live in these cities, but you don't have equal representation for people outside these cities in places like rural areas or like people the areas that are underdeveloped at all points of time. But notice how constituencies are like systematically ignored these rural areas. Note, rural areas, even though they have things like land or like large amount of land mass, they inherently will not be gone ahead and represented because they have lower population. This means two rural areas they clumped into one and then put out as a constituency. Why is this bad? One, notice it leads to bad representation. Notice the inherent incentive to go ahead and win the masses is something that's meant. You want to appease the masses. You want to win in their constituency. But notice there are large amount of constituencies in cities. Insofar as this is true, this asymmetric allotment is extremely bad. Why is this true? Large amount of leaders are now coming from these areas of upwards. This is bad because insofar as these rural areas are coming to small representations or small constituencies who, one, have shitty resource allocation. Meaning, insofar as I have a lot of leaders coming out from cities, they go ahead and lobby in the parliament for better resource allocation to the cities that are already overdeveloped. Meaning, these rural areas that are either clumped into one or aren't given equal representation are never able to go ahead and gain the resources for things like infrastructure development, etc., etc. This is bad because one, we directly go ahead and respond to that idea on keeping the marginalized. Meaning, the people that are living in these rural areas, people that are not working the equal amount of resource allocation or like these resources that they inherently deserve or need, are inherently being ignored because they are not being given enough representation in the parliament at all points of time. This is systemically because you are not having a lot of population, not because, which means you are not being represented just because the people in your city are not being to other cities at all points of time. Right? But notice why this is bad. People in these rural areas still deserve things like representation. They still deserve things like development. Insofar as you do not have a large amount of leaders able to go ahead and lobby for them, they are never able to go ahead and allot these resources at all points of time. But more importantly, insofar as you do not have things like infrastructure and rural development, you have one extremely bad development. Because one, notice cities develop on a much faster scale, and these rural areas now fall behind. On the long term, this is inherently bad because insofar as you want to go ahead and get more resources, you are never able to go ahead and do so. But notice why this is bad for the cities at all points of time. Insofar as there are large amount of constituencies just in these cities, now there is extremely high urbanization and rural urban development because there's a lot more red tape. Notice that there are a lot more leaders having a lot more conflicting ideas on how to develop a city. Insofar as these conflicting ideas exist, and insofar as they go ahead and butt heads on every single piece of development, they're never able to go ahead and have sustainable development. Right? Notice the delta change on our comparative and why it's so much better. Notice a person can two people can represent a city just as good as 40 because they know what their masses want. They still are able to go ahead and listen to the things that these masses are telling them. Their entire incentive is to go ahead and be voted in by appeasing to the masses, by appeasing to their vote bank. You have equal representation for cities no matter what. But notice why you do not have for these rural areas. The delta change is so small because now, for instance, if there are 50 seats, there are 30 coming out for cities, but only 20 for these rural areas. Insofar as this is true, we are not able to get enough resource allocation. But insofar as you go ahead and allocate every part of this, the country equitably, we are able to go ahead and receive representation for every single part of the country at all points of time. Meaning, one, you have better resource allocation. We are able to go ahead and lobby for every part of the country, when everybody gets equitable resources at all points of time. This leads to one, having more equitable development, but second, not like asymmetric development where cities go ahead and overtake these rural areas at all points of time.
Would it be fine with a non-democratic government that distributes resources between cities and rural areas equally?
I don't know why this POI matters, right? If you're talking about a democratic country, I don't know why this POI even matters. Moving on, I'll notice the response to that POI, they're basically talking about democratic countries and who has a better democratic representation of the system. We are the only thing that goes ahead and shows you why we have a better representation, why everybody's vote matters, because the outcomes are better. Me as an individual who lives in a rural area don't think that I have equal representation or a vote in the parliament insofar as I have only one or two constituencies or only one leader. Insofar as I know my vote matters, this is only when you have more government interest. This is only when we're able to go ahead and unlock the benefits of government insofar as you have better government interest or more mobilization at all points of time. Because one, people are actually trust that the government hears them. I know that insofar as I'm being represented, insofar as my area of land is being represented, I'm better off. But notice why this is bad on their side of the paradigm. Insofar as you do not have development, things like agriculture takes a massive hit because you don't have resource allocation, you don't have infrastructure development, you don't have education on things like this. Insofar as this is true, you have massive amounts of famine, poverty, etc. for these rural areas. Insofar as you are not being given resources, when your vote, you don't think your vote matters. This is why we think we have a much better democracy. Because people actually trust the government. People know that my vote actually matters because I'm being represented in parliament tomorrow. I know that insofar as I have a voice, I'm actually able to go ahead and get better outcomes. Because this, we think we are able to go ahead and have better political stability, which is extremely important in the post-colonial era. Thank you.
That opening opposition is that every constituency within itself is exactly the same and everyone behaves the same way, and that is the only way that they're able to access their benefits of better or more representation. The issue is this ignores all of the framing that Southeast Asia is just culturally quite diverse, and you have a lot of people that are misrepresented when you go ahead and just try to bucket all of them under one sort of constituency, regardless of what the population split is, because at that point then, what just on unitary math what ends up happening is in areas that have more population but their representation is still the same in the National Assembly, each person has relatively less say on what the policy is or relatively less say on what the outcomes of democratic elections are. What does this fundamentally mean? This means that fundamentally everyone's vote is not the same. Someone that is in a constituency that has a sparser population has a lot more valuable vote in terms of determining their representation at the final level and determining policy, and that vote is a lot more valuable than someone who is in the city. This fundamentally means that my vote is only useful insofar as I have good outcomes right now, and their case only works for the really best case where it's a really good government and will perpetually be a really good government. But what happens in the instances where something like a political dynasty is set up, when a Duterte comes up and starts carrying out wars against drugs, and then ends up going ahead and taking out and strategically excluding the people that have the less valuable vote right now from going ahead and ensuring that these people aren't able to affect outcomes at a natural cause. We think this is the kind of intuition as to why the principle matters regardless of what the utilitarian outcome is right now. This is the basis for the trust in the electoral system, because the universal adult franchise, which is one vote for one person, is the basis and the guarantee that governments give to its people that you have a say in the way that you are governed. This becomes compounded by the fact that there is only one house in the parliament, which means the results of this election are significantly more likely to determine the quality of the governance that ends up happening, as opposed to a two-house system where probably there are elected representatives and selected representatives. Then things get discussed a lot more. We think what this means is the value of the vote increases significantly within this context, and therefore it becomes that much more important to ensure that each vote has equal value. What happens on their side? We think on their side you have a loss of faith in the system of democracy in and of itself, because the government is unwilling to take a stance and provide an equivalent weightage to everyone within the population. This means that it's far more likely on their side that people in the urban areas feel that, oh look, my vote doesn't matter, anyways I'm getting less. And who are these people most likely to be? These are most likely to be the working class in the urban areas, the dock workers, the stevedores, the people that drive and carry out the service economy in these places, that also are under the pressures of having to work meal to meal, having to work daily for labors to sustain their families, that are living in slums and at that point they are further able to justify the decision of not being able to take the task of going out to vote because they have more important things on their plate. The idea that my vote matters less than someone else is something that's inherently defeatist and makes them feel like they don't want, and inherently makes them feel like they don't want to contribute to democracy. This means that you lose political opt-out from these types of people, and this inherently means that the democracy on their side is truly less representative. On the comparative, yes, probably cities have more constituencies and they have more elected leaders represented in the parliament. Why is this fine, or rather why is this actually good? Because not all of the cities are 100% Mukesh Ambani's and own all of the property. It's most likely that one seat out of these in the city is probably industrialist and richly backed or whatever. We think there are others that probably cater to the working class and have people elected accordingly as well, which means within the city we have a lot more granular representation, which is accurate in terms of representing what the demographic makeup of the people within this country is. This is important because the government governs the people, not the land. We think as a result of this, it's far more important to be representative of the demographic makeup that you have rather than what the land split actually ends up becoming. But more importantly, it's just unclear as to whether this land split ever actually ends up being done well in and of itself, because to what extent can you make equally, like even if you can, like you obviously can make equal area territories, but what do they meaningfully look like? If I have a small island and the equal area threshold is maybe I need to have a bigger area, do I just give some more part of the mainland island to the small island that has no connect in terms of the way of life, that has no similarities in terms of how they're governed or things like that? We think this leads to far more unrepresentative governing that ends up happening. But lastly, their claim is that look, there's going to be like vote capturing and things like that, all bad sorts of things. The first thing I would like to note that these sorts of practice need to be dealt with on a comparative, which means on their side, it's far easier to do things like carry out freebie campaigns in rural areas because the per person vote value is a lot more. You need to convince less people to win a constituency, which is why in a lot of democracies you see people doing things like, especially in Bangladesh, seeing people give out freebies in rural areas because they're able to be convinced for far less, and then they're able to build these rural strongholds that don't ever get uprooted despite whatever the change in the demographic makeup and the interests of people are. We think this is how large political parties are able to perpetuate their power and entrench dynasties.
The majority in this being mentioned, if the majority are very should we stop giving all support to not in these big states? By your logic, we should.
I mean, but the issue is, we think on your side, the people in the south are ones that are convinced far more easily by the same tactics that opening opposition uses in terms of say giving freebies or doing mass appeasement or things like that, which means it's far more likely that those people they end up gaining power over there in the first place, or even if they don't, they're able to end up gaining a lot more power through the cities and end up drowning these voices out in the first place. We think regardless of what the outcomes are, if it's an undemocratic government, it's probably going to be undemocratic on both sides. What ends up saving democracies is the backbone of it, that everyone has an equal say in determining whether someone undemocratic should lead or not. On their side, some people inherently have a less amount of say in terms of choosing to remove the people or not. That means on their side, people in the south have lesser capability of trying to remove the same type of government that they want to go ahead and defend against. We think what that therefore means is we're able to protect the very basis for voting in and of itself a lot more. This is important because the opt-in into the political system itself is what brings about a lot of things like cooperation from the public in terms of adhering to policy. On the comparative, when this doesn't happen, we think people are more likely to resist the implementation of these sorts of policies, and that brings these things, that makes progress a lot slower. Even if everything is fine right now, they cannot guarantee it in the future. We guarantee it by protecting the vote. That's the most important thing.
People value their votes, they have an understanding about how they have a value of like what their vote is based on things like trust, things like understanding whether the government goes ahead and actually does something for them. How do you go ahead and how do people in general understand and figure out whether their vote matters, right? It comes from policy and comes from the decisions that the government makes, and it comes from an understanding as to how the government's decisions actually affect them. Two fundamental flaws in their case, right? Understand that we go ahead and tell you if you have multiple constituencies in a particularly concentrated area, what are the two kinds of faults that you have in policy, right? You have X amount of problems and 40 leaders for the same amount of problems. Understand that if you have like 2 leaders in a big city, you can probably fix the same amount of problems that 40 leaders can. The delta in this debate then becomes probably where the most development is required, because it's a post-colonial state. You probably require most development towards the vulnerable actors who are in the outskirts, people who probably have been alienated from society, people who probably don't have these resources, probably who aren't a part of the working class, right? People who are agriculturists, people who have been like colonized for years, who like probably undergone like serious repercussions because of their situations in the first place. Understand that they only get this sort of policy change when they have enough representation in the parliament, right? If one city has 40 leaders and the entirety of another state, because it's like scarcely populated but has people who have been alienated, they have like fewer leaders, it's much harder for these leaders to go ahead and create some sort of policy in the parliament, because all the leaders are going to push for this working class, are going to push for policies within the city. That's when distrust is created amongst these individuals. That's when you have majority of people not having an understanding as to whether their vote actually matters. What do we then tell you, and what is a major push that you get from Abhay on systemic harms or development, right? We tell you that if the city is going to, like if you have multiple leaders within a smaller concentrated area, because population is concentrated in one area, you don't necessarily get the best outcomes, right? If you have various leaders trying to create multiple change within a particular city or a particularly concentrated area, you have various harms. What does this look like? It looks like you going ahead and having multiple leaders conflicting over small things like creating an outer ring road for the city, because not everyone cares about the development of the city. They only care about winning their constituency. So they only care about creating policies that matter within their own constituency. That means you also have systemically harmed the entire city as a whole. You're not only alienating people outside the city because they never get these policies in the first place because they don't have enough representation. You also fragment your city internally because everyone is trying to go ahead and win their particular constituency. What then do we get on in terms of like politics as a whole, right? How does this then affect politics if you have multiple leaders in particular concentrated areas and if you necessarily don't have, right? Necessarily don't have enough representation outside in the outskirts and probably underdeveloped areas. What this looks like is, number one, you create more distrust in individuals who never get this policy from these rural areas. Second, it's more likely you have more appeasement politics because now these multiple leaders aren't able to aren't going to create enough change for you for these smaller constituencies to realize that you're actually creating some sort of change, because there are 40 leaders in my city. I don't know which one is actually creating some sort of change because there are only X amount of problems, right? What do the leaders then go ahead and do? They go ahead and have more appeasement politics. They go ahead and have like guarantees being pushed out. They have rallies where they go ahead and make promises, and that's how they try to appease the masses. And understand this is much worse off for democracy because they never get these policies out there because there are multiple leaders within fighting for certain simpler rules within the city. Second, you are less likely to achieve anything out of this because there are like multiple leaders trying to fix certain issues which cause detriment now.
Do cities and towns need the same amount of money?
What?
Do cities and towns need the same amount of money?
Not necessarily, right? You don't. It's about, okay. Let's talk about resource allocation, right? Understand that if certain cities are probably like more developed and probably other areas aren't as developed, and you need to pour in resources into developing these areas, because understand the context of this debate, right? It's happening in Southeast Asian countries, which means they're probably more service sector. You're probably care more about agriculture. You probably care about producing more things. You probably care about like silk or whatever. You need to go ahead and invest largely into these, as opposed to you going ahead and catering all your resources into the cities and into like the working class. Understand this is important because it's a post-colonial world where the country is trying to develop. The moment you go ahead and focus all your resources into this, because most policies and most things in the parliament are going to be catering towards these concentrated masses, you're less likely to have resource allocation into these places that actually require these resources. What do we then think the long-term harms are of not allocating resources properly, not having proper like systemic development, right? We think in the long run you're going to fragment people and you're going to alienate people who never had the resources, who never had the opportunities to come to these cities, or probably alienating them further away from these populations in the first place. Second, I think you create further distrust in the population to the point where they don't necessarily want to work with the government. They don't necessarily get the sort of development that the government requires in terms of creating better agriculture, better allocation of land. You don't necessarily get the types of resources into service sectors and things like that. Lastly, in terms of how it impacts in the long term into cities in itself, right? I think because there's extreme fragmentation within the city, you have high distrust within the people themselves. You create more fragmentation within the city as well. What does this look like? It looks like a large one constituency being backed by large industrialists and another constituency being backed by probably the slums in the city, right? Understand that because there's so much distrust and there's so much change in the type of policies that are being made, and because these leaders aren't able to come to a consensus to fix a particular type of issue, because there are so many leaders within a particular city, you're going to probably have lesser development in the city in the first place. What does this look like for the country in the long run, right? It looks like much worse off in terms of running better economy, because now you're not able to develop your industries, you're not able to develop your service sectors like agriculture and things like that, and you're also not able to develop as much in cities because you're stuck between various leaders playing dirty politics and appeasement politics. You're not necessarily getting the best policies out there. So you're much worse off for the vulnerable stakeholders, being the people who are being alienated. You're also worse off for people within these cities who have these opportunities but don't necessarily see some sort of delta, because there are multiple leaders trying to fix the same number of issues, and you necessarily don't achieve the most like valuable vote because not everyone is being equally represented. And for all of these reasons, vote opposition.
get national identity and a fair access to democracy on either sides via multiple measures that you take to improve democracies, because this is already an established democracy, which means you have already transferred power from kings and colonizers to people to make decisions for themselves. But a prerequisite to carry out any decision-making capacity and giving it to people is that this post-colonial state survives. The biggest problem in this debate is that both opening benches assume that this post-colonial state is already stable. I would argue that it's the opposite of this. In most instances, post-colonial states are quite unstable because of multiple reasons. But I just want to note, look at other Southeast Asian countries like Myanmar and Cambodia, which are highly highly undemocratic right now, even though they do have democratic representation. And the reason for that was the point at which they became post-colonial states. There was a lot of ethnic violence in these states, where there were multiple ethnic groups that tried to form dictatorships and take part of the national assemblies or just overthrow the government in general, as a consequence of which it was difficult for these countries to transition into peaceful democracies every 5 years. When democracies cannot transition into peaceful governments every 5 years, these democracies fall because people lose trust within these governments. It's not they stop voting, it's they go a step further. They actually revolt against the government. They try to bring it down and all sorts of stuff. There are two reasons for why it's certain that these democracies are going to be highly fragile. The first is that there is a racial and cultural divide or ethnic divide. This is something opening government asserts, but go check your notes. There is no reason for why you have such ethnic divides in Southeast Asian economies. This is true for three reasons. The first is that cross-border travel in Southeast Asia is quite easy, given that borders are quite close and these countries are quite small. So whenever you face war towards your group or you face famine in your region, you can easily move across the border into another country. Second, colonizers actively used the divide and conquer rule, pitching groups against each other in order to win over national assembly elections when they were trying to gain legitimacy, in order to gain more political representation from kings and stuff. And third, you had social hierarchy that did lead to some communities doing better because they were perceived to be better communities with more social wealth, and these communities would only prefer them over other communities, and they had no interest to actually democratize their wealth. As long as they were able to keep a hold of their wealth, they were able to entrench more power and get stronger with time. As a consequence of this, there were social hierarchies. I'm not saying that one ethnic community dominated all other ethnic communities. I'm just arguing that there was some power imbalance between ethnic communities. I think this is quite easy to believe. But you must also remember that communities lived in their own subgroups quite close to each other, and wasn't intermingling that everyone is living with each other. This is going to be important later on, but I just want you to remember that people lived within their own tight communities because people wanted comfort of their own people around them, because democratic rights weren't as established back then, that when you would face racial threats, you would have someone who, you would have the state saving you, you would only have to rely on people, so most people would still live in their own communities. So the first reason is that there's probably racial, ethnic, cultural divide, basically different groups with different powers. The second reason is that in post-conflict states, what you have are limited resources. This often causes widespread poverty with no checks and balances to make sure that everyone's life is improving. The reason for that is probably colonizers took away a lot of your resources. This is quite easy to believe because it's historically true that most colonizers entered into states not to actually educate people and make them Englishmen. They entered to take their resources, which explains why most people in these states are poor. Which means what you need to do is immediately improve the living conditions of these people by providing them education, healthcare, and build cities. Both opening governments say that, oh, well, cities get more resources. I don't think cities existed at that point of time. You need to build all of these from ground up. So the only thing that matters towards Patraland is surviving right now. Is about improving the living conditions of these people so they don't start revolting, and ensuring that there is no more ethnic and cultural violence among people of different groups. As long as you can maintain stability right now, you can get better democracies in the future. But let's look at what happens as a consequence of this motion on opposition. You choose option 2 over option 1. There are two. The consequence of this is that you have to divide constituencies into equal land masses. But the problem is, people who live in these constituencies simply cannot be shifted for two reasons. One, this takes a large money and a large part of the state, large powers from the state apparatus to just move people within different communities. And second, people have their own roots, they belong to their communities, they have cultural and ancestral backgrounds, they don't want to move. Which means the point at which you do create these constituencies based on equal land mass, you cannot ensure that people live within their own communities, they will be forced to intermingle. So one constituency will end up having multiple races, multiple groups, multiple ethnic identities. The problem with this is twofold. The first is that politicians that would stand for elections in these constituencies would still be forced to represent all of these people, and they would be forced to get elected no matter what, even if these groups hate each other. So if these groups hate each other, these politicians obviously cannot cater to all of them, because then they would be unpopular. So oftentimes they will start prioritizing certain groups over others in order to win elections. But you must remember that this is a post-colonial state, which means democratic institutions probably aren't as strong right now, and they need time to be built up, which means it's unclear why these politicians will definitely be kept in check. Insofar as these politicians cannot be kept in check, there's a high likelihood that these politicians might promote racist or biased rhetoric and instigate groups against each other based on ethnic or religious divide in order to win these constituencies. So sure, you might have politicians getting elected, and maybe they would even favor the majority of the people, but it doesn't ensure that they would favor everyone. This explains the right to fair access to democracy that opening government talks about. So as a consequence of this policy, politicians will be forced to represent everyone, and they will be forced to only cater to some groups over other groups in order to win. But the second impact of this is that groups will be forced to cooperate with each other in order to maximize the usage of resources. But the problem of this is that this is a post-colonial state where you have just gained democracy. These groups are still against each other. This is something that I've already explained before. It has to be credited in the debate. Which means, while they have incentives to cooperate, it's unclear why they would actively do so, insofar as they also have incentives to fight for resources and only benefit their own communities and no one else. Insofar as this is true, the end impact is that these groups do fight. They do attempt to overtake the government, and there is a high likelihood that such democracies fall. The point at which some groups try to overtake, it's protected. Some groups try to overtake, some groups try to have revolutionary ideas in their head. Now, I know this argument isn't certain. It could be true that these groups work with each other and actually use resources in an effective manner. But remember, this debate has to happen in a world where you have to weigh it out with anything else. The harm of this democracy falling is quite high, because if you cannot establish democracy right now, I already explained why you end up being countries like Cambodia or Myanmar where you cannot establish democracies in the future. So the likelihood of this democracy falling is so huge that you cannot risk taking option 2 over option 1. I would argue just take option 1, because you can ensure that you cater to specific groups with specific politicians, and you make sure at least democracy continues and it improves with time.
Characterization of what Patraland actually looks like. I think it's the reason why the capital is situated in Southeast Asia, and here's why. I wanted to note Southeast Asia is a cultural melting point. This is primarily because the landmass that constitutes present-day Southeast Asia sits between very active ancient trade routes. What this meant, it means is that it was very crucial to control this landmass for, it was beneficial for trading, but also because it was a very fertile landmass, so it was useful to control this landmass. What this means is, there's a lot of South Indian influence there's a lot of Chinese influence there's also a lot of Arab influence in this place, because it's a trade route and it's very fertile to control. This can also be empirically observed if you don't believe what I'm saying, because there's a strong South Asian influence in Cambodia, Malaysia and Thailand, and look at the temples that, like Angkor Wat and stuff, there are Tamil scriptures in the temples. But there's also Buddhist and Chinese influence, because a lot of Chinese people settled there, and you can see Buddhist monuments all over Thailand and stuff. But even you can observe strong Islamic influence in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, where there's no reason for strong Islamic influence to exist anyways. What this means is simple. I want you to note two things happens when this happens, right? When this is a cultural melting point, these communities form strong ethnic preferences within them. So what this looks like is a Patraland Bali is presumably supposed to be very Hindu and very little influence of Islam, but also a Patraland Java would probably have large Muslim populations which don't want to follow any Hindu population as well. There are two broad things that you need to conclude from here. One, these are very strong preferences, right? Because there are very strong religions in these areas that say you need to follow this religion, otherwise you will have eternal, you will be eternally damned and things like that. Which means it is very important for these people to follow these religions, and given that this penetration of education is probably less, these people strongly feel about these things. But also, more importantly, right, they have a history of fighting for resources with each other, which means probably these people don't really like each other's cultures and whatnot. So the conclusion here is Patraland is likely to be ethnically diverse with strong ethnic preferences. I want to prove why landmass-wise segregation is beneficial for ethnic groups to stay without fighting with each other. I think the only burden left to prove here is to show why ethnic groups largely stick to their own landmass and not whatever both governments say that there's a cultural melting point of every constituency has bunch of different ethnic groups. There are a few reasons for why this is true. I want you to know, right? You like to live in a community that follows the same values, speak the same same language and speak like follow the same things, right? I mean, I've been here for a week. I have not been able to talk to most people because they speak Kannada. I don't think most people would want to like live in like such a setup when like I don't know, you had no Google Translate 50 years back. I don't think that's a reason for why people live in different like intermingled communities specifically. But more importantly, right, this is usually also true because these are very tight-knit communities that ensure that you follow the religion. So any benefit you get from the community is probably because you are part of the community and there's a high option to be a part of this community, only then you get any benefits. Without getting benefits, why the fuck would you want to live in those places? But lastly and more importantly, right, it is so hard to move around Southeast Asia. Rajya is fucking lying. It's a landmass full of there's like 18,000 islands in Indonesia and Philippines. I don't see why is it so easy to move around in these places. What this largely means is Hindus probably stuck in Bali and Patraland Bali, and Muslims probably stuck in like Patraland Java. And that's probably how this landmass probably went about. I wanted to note this, the argument that we're going to make is simple, which is just that like Hindus in Patraland Bali are better off on our side, even if it's a smaller population, they get a better representation in the union. I hate the people who say we should assimilate and support the union. That's where I come from, and that's my like personal politics too. I wanted to note, right, if the population density is equal, it does not matter at all. This debate is symmetric as well. Which means there's something very important here. Certain ethnic groups are more densely populated and certain ethnic groups are less densely populated. What that means is the densely populated ethnic group has a resource crunch. That's probably true because in our post-colonial state, the colonial power is already like sucked out all the wealth from most places as possible. Which means you're probably in poverty, you need water, you need coal, you need other things to actually set up the things specifically. What this means is if you let them have one vote per person, this majority ethnic, like the densely populated ethnic group will probably force the rest of them to assimilate, take their resources, and if you don't believe this, just look at what East Malaysia has become. When you have skyscrapers in Kuala Lumpur, there is people without clothes in Kota Kinabalu, and that's not something we want, and that's exactly what Patraland will lead to. I think the simple conclusion, actually, you know what, Kota Kinabalu is not even the worst possible situation that could happen. The worst possible situation is the things that Raghav described, like Myanmar, like Cambodia, where people are so annoyed at the unions that they don't want to assimilate, they don't want to agree to anything within the union, and they take up arms and they fight. They fight like they fight in South Sudan, and that's what's the problem. So the first metric on why do we think we're able to preserve the democracy? I want to know, right? It's very simple because if you force people to assimilate and they don't have any capacity to fight against it, they will go ahead and protest because it's deep values for them. You don't believe this? Look at Sri Lanka. When you made Sinhala the national language, you said only if you read in Sinhala, we'll give you jobs. People, Tamils went and revolted and they died for it, right? I think the same thing with East Bengal when they said like Urdu will become national language, people went and revolted. This is a nascent democracy, and if people believe that even if the unions construct schools, if they believe that the schools are teaching not their language, not their values, I think people will not be willing to do this. They'll probably take up the arms and stuff. And if they take up arms, that's incredibly bad for them. I think on our comparative is a very simple thing that happens because you have the capacity to protect yourself because you have the same amount of votes as presumably the other ethnic group because it's probably like a landmass, like it's going to be same, and you'll probably get some way to protect yourself. Yes.
By your own framing, minorities live in one place, so even if it's done in the land basis, like there's just one that's overpowered.
So this is a absolute straw man because I said densely populated, not densely populated. So presumably like a tribal place will still have their vote to right, even if they have less population, but their land mass is huge, so they have a right to defend themselves. So even if let's take the absolute worst case, right? Let's say they have only one vote, they can at least form a caucus with the other people who have one vote, and they can defend themselves against the union. I think they need to defend themselves against the fucking union. Look, lastly on representation, I think this is pretty easy to resolve. What is the fundamental reason to vote? State controls your right. We give you some right to control the decisions that are made by the state. I think if I am a Hindu in Indonesia and you make the majority vote, I have no ability to control what the state does. What we do on our side is a comparative, right? We ensure at least some preferences are upheld. So an individual might have 10-15 preferences, but an individual caucus or an ethnic group will have a common preference of at least 2-3 things, right? They want development for them, they want jobs for them. These are things that are common to this ethnic group. Obviously, I don't think anybody is going to say, oh no, I don't want jobs for the ethnic group altogether. They want reservation and things like that. So at least some amount of representation happens on our side. There is no representation for the poor ethnic groups who are minority on opening government side. For all these reasons.
A couple more reasons why different ethnic groups are likely
likely to be within these equal land masses. The first is simply just because these are equal land masses. If you divided India up into the same number of states as it is right now, but with the, equal amount of land in each state, obviously you have some sort of crossover in terms of the ethnic groups that end up in these different states. But the second thing here, and this is what Raghav already explains, is just that lots of people were dragged to different places across the country. This is because cross-border travel within different countries is very accessible during this era, but also there's a lot of slave trade, etc., which means you drag people from one place to another within these equal land masses. But then also just intuitively know, if there's an equal landmass in a rural area and an equal landmass over a city, probably the ethnic composition of the city is vastly more different than the one within this rural area, which forces there to be a massive divide in terms of the composition of these land masses. This is asserted in opening government. We explain it. We are logically prior to that. What does this mean? The first thing is that we probably self-correct for ethnic conflicts. There are two reasons for this. The first is because if it is the case that there are many different ethnic compositions within these equal land masses, on our side of the house, we end up giving them the constituencies that allow them to operate on their own. On their side of the house, they cause infighting within these equal land masses for control over the constituency. Note that if it is the case, it's just probably better to have these kinds of arguments within parliament than within your equal landmass, because within your equal landmass, you probably revert to more physical forms of violence, whereas you can sort of ask a proxy to figure out what kind of resources you need in parliament on our side of the house. Raghav explains that tight-knit communities, people form tight-knit communities wherever they can. And additionally, because you form tight-knit communities, you are able to go into parliament and get what you want. On their side of the house, because even if you have tight-knit communities, they're sketched up between different land masses. It's harder for you to gain control of an adequate number of seats to get the resources that you need for your own community. You end up with infighting on their side of the house for policy decisions like reservation, resource allocation to different parts of your even just your own landmass. Note that because there's not an infinite number of seats that you can allocate, the population density of a rural area is much lower than an urban area. So obviously the way that you allocate resources within these equal land masses needs to be debated on, and this is how the politicians who end up being elected are probably going to make these choices. So on their side of the house, they end up with politicians that favor just their own in-groups. On our side of the house, we're able, because people form tight-knit communities, because there's probably likelihood of population growth, this means that you end up with self-correction for this problem, and you end up with groups that are able to elect politicians into parliament that are representative of themselves and are able to get them the resources that they need, specifically for their constituency. But just note here, what the infighting can lead to just physical violence, and this is probably the most scope impact within the debate, because you end up with people rioting on the streets when their idea of how they should be represented in government is just not possible. So at the end of this, you can understand. Wait 1 second. You can understand that on our side of the house, we're able to give people the kinds of representation that they want, and on their side, they force it into the hands of probably more powerful groups. But I want to note here why this is specifically distinct from opening government, because they say you will feel really sad when other people have more of a vote than you, or you will feel like your vote doesn't matter. The problem here, it is entirely contingent on whether or not the people that might have more of a vote than you, or who have more sway in parliament than you, are actually different than you. We explain why there's a massive difference between lots of people within these equal masses on their side of the house. Because it's pretty easy to live with the feeling of someone else having more of a vote than you if they are incredibly similar to you. If you feel like they have the same sort of policy interests in mind as you. On our side of the house, we're able to actually give people the kinds of constituencies that concentrate their own people and needs into government. Sure.
You are dividing based on population, not ethnicity. The polarization you talk about happens.
Yeah, okay, but this is already explained in Raghav's speech about why people are so likely to form tight-knit communities. You don't end up with a population explosion when you have different ethnicities mingling together, or at least on the comparative, you end up with more because people from the same religion are just more likely to get married to each other and have kids with each other. Which means that on our side of the house, yeah, I hope that explains this. The next thing I want to do is just explain why cities probably need more money than towns. And this will directly engage with opening opposition, because their entire case is that like you will just that these cities don't deserve as much as rural towns, but that people will feel disconnected from rural towns. The first thing here is just that there is a massive diminishing return on the kinds of investment that you can put into cities. So even if you allocate like 10x more money into cities as you do into towns, because the people there are probably just a little bit more are probably more educated, getting them to like a higher level of education is just it costs a lot more money. Whereas and this is just purely on how you feel, because if in a city or if in a town you're able to set up a school that wasn't there, this probably gets you the same amount of contentment that you would as a person in the city who then gets like a university or whatever. The next thing I want to explain in terms of opening opposition is just so additionally, there's just more people in cities, so there's a massive resource constraint. If cities want to offer welfare, because this is like there's like a high degree of wealth inequality within post-colonial cities. This means that they obviously need to have more resources. They need more constituencies. So even on your very own utility metric, obviously on our side of the house, like when you're able to give these people that money, they just feel more catharsis. The second thing here is that it's incredibly unsure whether towns are able to spend this money even as effectively as cities, even if they are supposed to get the same amount. Just because if cities are more educated, if cities are more are made up at least on our side of more constituencies, you end up with more competition to make sure that this that you are more convincing of how these resources should be used. On your side of the house, you probably end up with a monopoly in terms of the kinds of information that people are disseminated, which convinces them that they should spend it in worse ways than they might, whereas cities probably spend money better.
Today, by the way that governments, Tamil Nadu would still have 3 votes, and all the Bihar states would still have 5 votes. This is bad because you had to deal with Tamil revolution, you had to deal with secessionist violence, you had to deal with distrust of the state and a loss of identity for people who have belonged to the land. The path to victory at closing option is extremely simple. We will prove that why the ability to defend yourself against encroachment by majority and why the connection to land matters the most. The first question that I want to answer in my speech while simultaneously responding to CG is to prove that what's the most absolute unique certain benefit that you get only at sea. Which is to say that when you have a strong belief that you are able to make autonomous decisions about the land that you have lived in for so long, and when the people around you probably care about this as equally as you do, you probably are much more open to government intervention. This probably means that you probably are much likelier to negotiate in good faith. This means that the metric of stability uniquely gets resolved when most of these states are able to form a caucus and agree that bottom line stability that they want is the most important thing. This means that much more open to open these states for tourism, are probably much more open to export the things that they grow outside of whatever these states are, and that's a good thing because on the comparative they are extremely there's extreme amounts of animosity because they feel like their rights are being encroached, they feel like their identity is being encroached. Insofar as we agree with CG that these people have lived on these lands for a really long amount of time and the ability for them to move out of landmass is absolutely a fringe case. We prove that by in most instances what's true is what Shabin says, that you live in this land for an extremely long amount of time. But even if I agree with Raghav that people will probably have to move out if the land is drawn disproportionately, I think this is just a repackage of what OG says, the land is going to be drawn unevenly. I think there needs to be a burden on CG that is not fulfilled as to why if you want to have a population that is 20% equally everywhere and a land that only has 10 lakh of population, you want it to have 15 lakh, what would you do of the population? I think population will have to move to that island anyways. This means that in most instances what Shabin says is true, that people belonging to a landmass are able to come to better decisions because they can caucus their needs together. This means they have an ability to be defensive, to defense against majority encroachment, and that's the first metric that we use on closing option as to why this is going to be done in a good way. Second thing that I want to talk about is that why the outcomes that you get is much more important and why we unlock efficient lawmaking exclusively on closing opposition. The idea here is extremely simple. What Shabin has said to you is that these people on these lands have extremely close ties. This means their ability to make decisions are just simply much more faster. This also means that the decision-making calculus are just simply much more proximate to them, this means that they are much more likely to overlap. What this means is that when you probably are going to make a decision for the bottom line development that you want for you, it's much likely to come to a decision faster. But then secondly, you can see the ability of consensus decision making much more uniquely on our side, because you realize that in distinct decision making processes this takes much more longer and faster. But then on the comparative, the likelihood of just slugfest politics is much more bigger, because you have to compete, like you have to campaign competing interests with different groups, which turns the worst case harm off towards OG. What OG says to this is a few things. One, land is going to be unevenly divided. Second, people are just going to coerce the decision of people who don't have access to wealth and power. And third, property rights are taken away. The response to this are extremely simple. One, these are problems you would solve anyways if you are a post-colonial state. I think if you want more land to develop, you are going to nationalize industries on either side of your land. But then secondly, I'm unsure as to why people like industrialists have infinite power to overlap the differences over a particular union of people. So when Assam land was nationalized, the tea workers acted as a core union group against the resistance of industrialists. That means that you probably have the ability as disempowerished workers to still vote for what you want, because the land that you own is much more proximate to you. I'm unsure as to why the coercion mechanism works at opening government. But then thirdly, there are still solutions at symmetric ages. You have courts that are important to set up land distribution. You probably have industrial tribunals that deal with cases. I think these are problems that are solved on either side of the house. I'm unsure as to why the response at OG is that land is just unevenly divided and people just get coerced is a fair mechanism. Even if this is mitigation, what are the other things that OG has said? OG said that the idea that your vote matters less is defeatist and this leads to bad outcomes. One, I think the mitigation is really simple. People do agree to bottom line agreements, as Sir pointed out. This means that you probably want more land, you probably want more hospitals, you probably want more welfare. But what happens uniquely on the comparative, which is much worse, is that majority decided that you don't want more madrasas because the majority population is Hindu, and that's a bad thing. And this means that your ability to have more representation for your own people, because the population is extremely diverse, is much worse, because most of the majority decision making just coerces the other people. This means that one, this flips the idea of coercion, but it's also proves that why the ability of bottom line agreement still exists. The second thing I want to do is that they say you have bad politics because you have freebies. I think the likelihood of politicians deciding the least common denominator, which is people being poor, much more on their side, because when they want to win the majority vote in constituencies that are extremely sought after, means that incumbents just give out more freebies and unconditional cash donations because they want to retain them. This means this also makes it hard for opposition leaders to get power because they make higher promises and much bigger promises. This leads to slugfest politics. On the comparative, you have the ability to disengage from all of this and have leaders that prioritize your interests, because the land that they get, the land that you live in, is much more complex and much more diverse than other people can get to. This means that your identity and the things that are proximate to you are never likely to overlap. This means that politicians will likely to find the least common denominator, which is either the majority identity or the identity of people who are just much more proximate to them.
If on our side the Tamil Nadu state revolts because they're angry, on their side it's the majority Bengal, which are more people that revolts. They have to be comparative.
This is comparative because on our comparative, the most disenfranchised people have much more capacity to revolt because they see their rights getting fucked over. Secondly, they uniquely have the idea of making much more group-wise decision making. On the comparative, you are much more likely to be disenfranchised because most accessible decision making comes from people who are in majority. As Sean points out, when you probably have lesser madrasas, there is more reason for you to revolt, there is more reason for you to be pissed off. This means that if we will do metrics, one, more trust in state, and then secondly, better stability. Because we prove that when you probably have ability to make popular decision making, you are much more likely to discuss things about stability. So if you want more, in a post-colonial state, you want states to be much more stable and have less democratic backsliding. This only unlocks when the states that feel the most encroached upon and disenfranchised have the ability to make autonomous decisions about their land. When you have the system on their side, populations are extremely diverse. Most politicians have competing interests. What they focus on is what you can get the least common denominator. This increases the amount of freebie politics. This increases the amount of majoritarian influence. You have the ability to defend against your rights only at voting.